He collapsed in front of me in the cold kitchen of that grand Manhattan penthouse. His face went pale, and the world felt like it stopped spinning for a moment so terrible I can still hear the silence broken only by his breath struggling to come. I stood there, apron drenched in sweat, trembling hands on his chest, the only witness to a millionaire's fall from grace. Maybe you're cooking for someone who never says thank you or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? I promise today's story will move you. The kitchen was my small kingdom, though cramped and smothered by sleek steel and glass walls that belonged to him, the man who owned not just the kitchen, but my life. My tired palms felt the rough edge of the oven's handle as I checked the roast, the scent of rosemary mingling with the faint buzz of the city 60 floors below. Laughter floated from the dining room, a celebration I wasn't invited to join. It was always like this. My hands created the feast, yet I remained the invisible shadow behind the grandeur. I am Margaret Santos, 73 years old, and I have spent the last 28 years cooking in this tower of glass and steel that pierces the Manhattan sky. My fingers are permanently stained with turmeric and olive oil, my back curved from years of bending over stoves and sinks. But my heart carries the weight of every meal I've prepared with love, only to watch it disappear into mouths that never tasted the sacrifice behind each spoonful. The marble countertops gleamed under the harsh LED lights, reflecting my weathered face like a mirror I preferred to avoid. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, stocked with ingredients that cost more than most people's weekly salary. Wagyu beef, imported truffles, caviar that arrived fresh from Russia every Tuesday. Mr. Camden's fortune seemed endless. Millions upon millions in assets, investments in the stock market that multiplied faster than I could count, even cryptocurrency and Bitcoin holdings that his financial advisor mentioned in hushed tones during their monthly meetings. But all that wealth couldn't buy what I had given freely for nearly 3 decades, the taste of home. I remember my first day in this penthouse like it was yesterday, though my joints remind me it was a lifetime ago. I was 45 then, recently widowed, desperate for work that would pay enough to keep my own tiny apartment in Queens. The employment agency sent me to this address on Fifth Avenue, and when I stepped off the elevator into the marble foyer, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. The ceilings stretched so high they seemed to touch the clouds, and crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across walls lined with paintings that probably cost more than I would earn in 10 years. Mr. Jonathan Camden was younger then, still in his 40s, with dark hair that hadn't yet turned silver and eyes that held more warmth than they would in later years. He stood in his perfectly pressed suit, reviewing my references with the casual indifference of a man who had everything money could buy, except the one thing that mattered most. His wife had left him 6 months earlier, taking their young daughter but leaving behind their son, Tommy, who was just 5 years old and spent most of his time with nannies who came and went like seasons. "Can you cook real food?" he asked me that first day, not looking up from my paperwork. Not that fancy nonsense the last woman tried to serve. I want food that tastes like it means something. I nodded, though my voice barely managed to whisper, "Yes, sir, I can cook food that feeds the soul." He hired me on the spot, but I don't think he truly understood what those words would mean until years later, when it was almost too late. Those early days blend together like ingredients in a well-stirred soup. I learned the rhythms of that household the way I learned to read Tommy's moods, carefully, patiently, with attention to the smallest details. Mr. Camden left for work before dawn, his coffee black and his breakfast simple, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, orange juice freshly squeezed. I would hear his footsteps echo through the marble halls, quick and purposeful, carrying the weight of business deals and board meetings that would add millions to his already vast wealth. Tommy was different. He moved through that enormous apartment like a ghost, always quiet, always watching. His father had hired the best nannies money could buy, women with degrees from prestigious universities who spoke 3 languages and knew how to organize educational activities that would prepare him for the elite private school he would attend. But none of them knew how to make his eyes light up the way they did when I let him help me measure flour for fresh bread, or when I taught him to crack eggs without breaking the yolk. "Why do you always hum when you cook?" he asked me one afternoon, perched on a stool beside the kitchen island while I kneaded dough for dinner rolls. I paused, my hands still working the dough, and realized I hadn't even noticed I was doing it. "I suppose it's because cooking is like music, sweetheart. Every ingredient has its own note, and when you put them together just right, they make a song." He considered this seriously, the way children do when they're trying to understand something that adults take for granted. "What song are you making now?" I smiled, flour dusting my cheek as I wiped it with the back of my hand. "Today, I'm making a song that says, 'Welcome home.'" That became our ritual. Every day when Tommy came home from school, I would have something special waiting, cookies still warm from the oven, or soup that steamed in perfect spirals, or sometimes just a glass of milk and a listening ear while he told me about his day. His father's business empire continued to grow, success measured in stock portfolios and profit margins, but in that kitchen, wealth was measured in different ways. A child's laughter, the perfect rise of bread, the satisfaction of creating something with your own 2 hands that nourished both body and spirit. But as the years passed, something shifted in that household, like milk beginning to sour before you can smell it spoiling. Mr. Camden grew colder. His business success brought new pressures, new demands on his time and attention. The stock market had made him incredibly wealthy, but it also consumed him. He spent long hours on conference calls with investors, discussing portfolio diversification and market volatility in a language I didn't understand but could feel in the tension that filled the air whenever he was home. His wealth had grown into the hundreds of millions, with investments spread across real estate, bonds, and even emerging markets like cryptocurrency. The financial magazines that arrived addressed to him spoke of his empire in reverent tones, calling him a visionary, a master of capital growth. Yet for all his vast fortune, he seemed to shrink a little more each year. Tommy grew too, as children do, but the light in his eyes began to dim. The private schools, the tutors, the pressure to excel, it all weighed on him like stones in his pockets. By the time he was 12, our afternoon conversations had become rare treasures. Stolen moments when his father wasn't around to remind him that he had homework to finish or extracurricular activities to attend. And I continued to cook, to clean, to maintain the smooth operation of a household that ran on schedules tighter than clockwork. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being Margaret Santos, the woman who had once sung while she cooked. I became simply the help, a fixture in that kitchen, as permanent and unremarkable as the marble countertops I polished every morning. The indignities started small, the way most erosions begin, a grunt instead of a thank you. Meals eaten in silence, without comment or acknowledgement. Instructions delivered in clipped, impatient tones that made me feel like an inconvenience, rather than someone who had devoted years to caring for this family. "The roast was overcooked last night," Mr. Camden would say, not looking up from his newspaper while I served his morning coffee. No greeting, no recognition that I had been up since 5 a.m. preparing his breakfast exactly the way he preferred it. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll be more careful with the timing." But careful wasn't enough. Perfect wasn't enough. Nothing was enough, because I had become invisible, and invisible people's contributions don't matter, even when they pour their hearts into every meal. The day I found the note changed everything, though I didn't understand its significance until much later. I was cleaning Mr. Camden's study, dusting the mahogany bookshelves that held volumes he never read, when a piece of paper fluttered to the floor from between the pages of a financial journal. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Jay, the investment in the overseas account needs to be moved immediately. The IRS investigation is getting closer. If they find the Bitcoin transfers, everything falls apart. The shell companies won't protect us forever. We need to liquidate and move the assets to the Cayman Holdings before the audit next month. Burn this after reading. R. My hands trembled as I read those words. I didn't understand all the financial terminology, but I understood enough. Mr. Camden wasn't just wealthy, he was hiding his wealth. The millions he'd accumulated through stock market investments and cryptocurrency trading weren't all legally declared. The fortune that paid for this penthouse, for Tommy's expensive education, for my modest salary, was built on secrets that could destroy everything if they came to light. I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my apron pocket, my heart racing. This wasn't my business, I was just the cook, just the invisible woman who kept the household running. But knowledge has weight, and I could feel this secret pressing against my chest like a stone. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The kitchen felt different somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't name. I was making Tommy's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, the same recipe my mother had taught me 40 years earlier, when Mr. Camden entered the kitchen, something he rarely did. "Margaret," he said, and I was startled to hear him use my name instead of simply barking orders. "I need to speak with you." I turned from the stove, wiping my hands on my apron, unconsciously touching the place where the note rested in my pocket. "Yes, sir?" But before he could continue, his face went white. His hand clutched at his chest and his knees buckled. I watched in horror as this powerful man, this millionaire who commanded boardrooms and controlled vast fortunes, crumpled to the kitchen floor like a discarded piece of paper. "Mr. Camden!" I dropped to my knees beside him. My training as a young woman, I had worked briefly as a nurse's aide before I married, kicking in automatically. His pulse was rapid and weak, his breathing shallow. "Can you hear me? Stay with me." His eyes found mine, and for the first time in years, I saw him truly see me. Not the cook, not the help, not the invisible woman who cleaned up after his life. He saw Margaret Santos, the person who had cared for his family with quiet devotion for 28 years. "The pain," he gasped, his hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. "My chest. Can't breathe." I was already reaching for my phone, dialing 911 with fingers that shook but held steady enough to punch the numbers. While I waited for the ambulance, I loosened his tie, elevated his legs with kitchen towels, and spoke to him in the calm, soothing voice I had once used to comfort Tommy after nightmares. "Help is coming, Mr. Camden. Just breathe slowly, in and out. That's it. You're going to be okay." But even as I said the words, I wondered if they were true. This man who had seemed invincible, whose wealth had insulated him from every ordinary worry, looked fragile and mortal, lying on his own kitchen floor. The marble that had once seemed so elegant now felt cold and unforgiving beneath my knees. The paramedics arrived within minutes, the advantage of living in a building where wealth could buy faster response times. They worked with professional efficiency, asking questions I answered while Mr. Camden drifted in and out of consciousness. They loaded him onto a stretcher, and suddenly I found myself in the back of an ambulance, racing through Manhattan traffic toward Mount Sinai Hospital. I don't know why I went with him. It wasn't my job. I wasn't family. I was just the cook who happened to be there when his body decided it had carried enough stress, enough pressure, enough of the weight that comes with building and hiding vast fortunes. But something in his eyes when he looked at me on that kitchen floor had changed everything. For that moment, I hadn't been invisible. The hospital was a blur of sterile lights and hurried conversations. I sat in the waiting room, still wearing my apron spotted with flour and herbs, feeling out of place among the polished surfaces and urgent efficiency. Nurses and doctors moved past me like I was part of the furniture, just another piece of background in the drama of saving lives. It was hours before a doctor approached me, his expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learn to master when delivering news that could go either way. "Are you Mrs. Camden?" he asked, consulting his clipboard. "No, I started, then paused. What was I? The employee? The cook? The woman who had held this man's hand while he fought for breath? "I'm Margaret Santos. I work for the Camden family. I was with him when he collapsed." The doctor nodded, making a note. "Mr. Camden has suffered a major heart attack. The next 24 hours will be critical. Is there family we should contact?" Tommy. My heart clenched as I thought of him, probably still at his after-school activities, unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. His mother lived in California now, remarried to a man who had made it clear that Tommy was not part of their new life. There was no one else. "His son," I said. "Thomas Camden. He's 16. I can call him." The hardest conversation of my life was made from a payphone in the hospital corridor, my voice steady despite the tears I couldn't seem to stop. Tommy's silence when I told him stretched so long I thought the connection had broken. Finally, he spoke. "Is he going to die?" "Margaret?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but he's strong, and the doctors are doing everything they can. Can you come to the hospital?" "I'm on my way." While I waited for Tommy to arrive, I called the penthouse to cancel the evening's dinner party. 12 guests who had been expecting to celebrate another of Mr. Camden's successful business ventures. The guests took the cancellation with the casual indifference of people accustomed to last-minute changes in the lives of the wealthy. After all, there would be other parties, other deals, other opportunities to network and profit. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that I had just made decisions that weren't mine to make. I had canceled his appointments, contacted his son, spoken to his doctors. For the first time in 28 years. I had acted not as his employee, but as someone who cared what happened to him. The invisible woman had become visible, if only to herself. Tommy arrived within an hour, his school uniform wrinkled, his face pale with the kind of fear that comes when you're old enough to understand mortality, but young enough to believe in your own invincibility. He had grown tall in the past few years, nearly 6 feet now, but sitting in that hospital chair, he looked like the 5-year-old boy who used to help me crack eggs for Sunday pancakes. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bad enough," I admitted, because I had learned long ago that children deserve honesty about the things that matter. "But your father is a fighter. He didn't build everything he has by giving up easily." We sat together through that long night, sharing bad coffee from vending machines and memories of better times. Tommy told me about his plans for college, his fear that his father would never approve of his dream to study music instead of business. I told him stories about his father as a younger man, before the weight of wealth and success had hardened him into someone even his own son barely recognized. "He wasn't always like this," I said, watching the fluorescent lights flicker overhead. "When you were little, he used to come home early just to hear about your day. He kept every drawing you made on his desk at work." Tommy's eyes widened with surprise. "He did?" "He did. Success changes people, sweetheart. Sometimes it makes them forget what mattered before they had everything they thought they wanted." As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the hospital windows with pale gold light, a doctor approached us with news that would change everything. Mr. Camden had survived the night, but the heart attack had been massive. He would need surgery, followed by months of recovery. His high-stress lifestyle, the constant pressure of managing vast investments, the weight of hiding assets from government scrutiny, the isolation that comes with trusting no one, had nearly killed him. "He's asking for Margaret," the doctor said, consulting his notes. "Are you Margaret?" I stood on shaking legs, my apron wrinkled from the long night in uncomfortable chairs. "Yes, that's me. He wants to see you before the surgery." The intensive care unit was a maze of machines and monitors, each one beeping out the rhythm of lives hanging in the balance. Mr. Camden looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished without his expensive suits and commanding presence. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that were keeping him alive, and his face was gray with the exhaustion of a body that had been pushed beyond its limits. But his eyes were alert when they found mine, and in them I saw something I had almost forgotten existed. Gratitude. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they had removed just hours earlier. "You saved my life." I moved closer to his bed, my hand finding his in a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. "You would have done the same for anyone." He shook his head slightly, wincing with the effort. "No, I wouldn't have. I've forgotten how to see people, how to care about anyone except myself and my business deals. But you've been taking care of my family for 28 years, and I never even said thank you." The tears I had been holding back since the ambulance ride finally spilled over. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." His grip on my hand tightened. "There are things I need to tell you, Margaret. Things about the business, about money I've hidden, about mistakes I've made that could hurt Tommy if something happens to me. The investigation—" "I know," I said quietly, and his eyes widened with shock. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the note I had found in his study, now creased from being carried through the longest night of my life. "I found this yesterday when I was cleaning your office." He stared at the paper in my hand, and I watched the color drain from his already pale face. "You read it." "I did. Are you going to—" "Mr. Camden," I interrupted, my voice gentle but firm. "I'm 73 years old. I've spent most of my life taking care of other people's secrets, cooking their meals, cleaning up their messes. I'm not about to stop now." The relief in his eyes was palpable, but it was followed quickly by something else: shame. "I need to make things right, Margaret. For Tommy's sake, if nothing else. The money, the legal money, it's enough. More than enough. The rest, the hidden accounts, the cryptocurrency holdings that the government doesn't know about, I have to come clean before they find out on their own." I squeezed his hand. "Then you'll come clean, after you get better. After you come home and have a chance to think clearly about what matters most. What if the surgery— what if I don't make it? Then I'll make sure Tommy knows who his father really was. Not the man who made mistakes out of fear and greed, but the man who loved him enough to want to set things right." The surgery took 8 hours. Tommy and I maintained our vigil in the waiting room, joined periodically by business associates who came to pay their respects but left after brief, uncomfortable conversations. They spoke in whispers about stock portfolios and investment strategies, about the impact Mr. Camden's illness might have on their own financial interests. None of them asked about him as a person, about his fears or hopes, or the son who sat quietly in the corner, staring out the window at a city that suddenly seemed vast and indifferent. When the surgeon finally emerged, his expression was cautiously optimistic. The operation had been successful, but Mr. Camden's road to recovery would be long and uncertain. He would need to make significant changes to his lifestyle: less stress, better diet, regular exercise, and most importantly, finding ways to manage the pressure that had nearly killed him. "The next few weeks will tell us a lot about his long-term prognosis," the doctor explained. "Heart attacks of this magnitude often serve as wake-up calls. Patients either make the necessary changes and go on to live full lives, or they return to old patterns and face increasing health risks." As we left the hospital that first morning, Tommy walked beside me in silence. Both of us exhausted from the emotional marathon we had endured. The city was waking up around us, coffee shops opening, taxis honking through morning traffic, people hurrying to jobs that seemed suddenly precious in their ordinary predictability. "Margaret," Tommy said as we waited for a cab to take us home, "what's going to happen to us?" It was a question I had been asking myself through the long hours of waiting, but hearing it from him made the uncertainty feel more real and more urgent. I don't know, sweetheart, but whatever happens, we'll face it together. The penthouse felt different when we returned, not just empty, but hollow somehow, as if Mr. Camden's near-death experience had drained the life from its expensive walls and marble floors. I made Tommy breakfast while he showered and changed for school, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in a world that had shifted beneath our feet. But nothing was normal anymore. The knowledge I carried about the hidden assets, the financial investigations, the legal troubles that could destroy everything Mr. Camden had built, weighed on me like a second shadow. I was no longer just the cook who prepared meals and kept house for a wealthy family. I had become the keeper of secrets that could send a man to prison and leave his son with nothing. Over the following days, as Mr. Camden remained in intensive care, Tommy and I fell into new routines. I continued to cook his meals, but now we ate them together, talking about his classes, his friends, his worries about his father. He helped me with dishes, something that would have been unthinkable in the carefully structured hierarchy of our previous life, and we discovered that conversation came easily when the barriers of employer and employee were temporarily set aside. "Do you think he'll change?" Tommy asked one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. Really change, I mean, not just until he gets better, but permanently. I considered the question while I rinsed plates, thinking about the man I had seen in that hospital bed, vulnerable, grateful, shaken by his own mortality. I think he wants to change. Whether he can is another question entirely. He's always been so focused on money, on making more and more. Sometimes I think he loves his investments more than he loves me. The pain in his voice broke my heart. "Oh, sweetheart, that's not true. Your father, he doesn't know how to show love the way other people do. His own father was the same way, all business and no warmth. But he does love you. I've seen the way he talks about you when you're not around, the pride in his eyes when you accomplish something." Tommy looked skeptical, and I realized how little his father had shared his feelings with his own son. The emotional distance that had grown between them was as vast as the difference between their worlds, one defined by teenage hopes and dreams, the other consumed by the pressure of managing hundreds of millions of dollars in assets while hiding financial crimes from government investigators. A week after the heart attack, Mr. Camden was moved from intensive care to a private room, and I was allowed to visit during regular hours. The improvement in his appearance was remarkable. Color had returned to his cheeks, and though he remained weak, his eyes held a clarity that had been missing for months before the cardiac event. "How's Tommy?" was his first question when I entered the room, carrying a thermos of homemade chicken soup. "He's scared," I answered honestly, settling into the chair beside his bed. "But he's strong, like his father." Mr. Camden managed a weak smile. "Like his father used to be, you mean? Before I let fear turn me into someone I didn't recognize." I unscrewed the thermos cap, filling the small cup with soup that steamed in the sterile hospital air. Fear makes us do things we never thought we were capable of, both good and bad. The question now is what you do with the fear that's left. He accepted the cup gratefully, sipping the familiar flavors that had sustained his family for years. "I've been thinking about everything, Margaret. About the money, the legal troubles, the choices that got me here. I need to make things right, but I'm terrified that fixing my mistakes will destroy everything I've built for Tommy." "What good is wealth built on lies?" I asked gently. "What kind of inheritance is money that comes with the constant fear of discovery?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the hospital window at the Manhattan skyline that represented everything he had achieved and everything he stood to lose. "The investigation is closer than I thought. My attorney called yesterday. They've frozen some of the overseas accounts, and it's only a matter of time before they trace the connections back to me." My heart sank, though I tried not to let it show in my expression. "How long do you have?" "Maybe 6 months if I'm lucky. less if they find the cryptocurrency transactions or the shell companies. His voice dropped to a whisper. I could go to prison, Margaret. Everything could be gone. The house, Tommy's college fund, your job. I've destroyed it all by trying to keep what I thought was mine. I reached for his hand, the same gesture that had seemed so natural in this sterile environment, but would have been unthinkable in the formal distance of his penthouse. Then we figure out how to protect what matters most. Tommy? Tommy. And your own soul, if there's any of it left to save. Over the following weeks, as Mr. Camden's physical recovery progressed, we developed a plan that would have seemed impossible during the years when I was merely his employee. With the help of his attorney, a man who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the financial deceptions he had been asked to facilitate, Mr. Camden began the process of coming forward voluntarily. The strategy was risky, but offered the best chance of avoiding complete financial ruin. By cooperating with the IRS investigation and voluntarily disclosing the hidden assets, he could potentially negotiate reduced penalties and avoid criminal prosecution. The vast majority of his wealth was legitimate: profits from early investments in technology stocks, real estate development projects, and carefully managed portfolios that had grown substantially over 20 years of disciplined financial management. But the hidden portions, the offshore accounts, the cryptocurrency holdings that had been moved through shell companies, the assets that had been deliberately concealed from tax authorities, those would have to be surrendered, along with substantial penalties and interest that would reduce his fortune by more than half. I'll still have enough to take care of Tommy's education, he said during one of our hospital conversations, his voice stronger now but carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape his entire life. The penthouse will have to go, of course. The cars, the vacation homes, most of the luxury that I told myself was important. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. I thought about the marble halls and crystal chandeliers, the kitchen where I had spent 28 years preparing meals for a family that rarely seemed to taste them. Where will you live? I've been thinking about that house in Westchester, the one we used to go to when Tommy was small. It needs work, but it's completely legitimate. Bought with legal money, properly documented. Tommy always loved it there. I remembered that house, smaller and warmer than the Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by trees that changed color with the seasons instead of glass towers that reflected nothing but steel and sky. It was where Mr. Camden had seemed most human, where he used to push Tommy on the swing set and where we had once had a picnic on the back lawn while he taught his son to fly a kite. And what about your work, your business interests? His expression grew thoughtful. That's the interesting part. Losing the pressure of hiding assets, of constantly looking over my shoulder for government investigators, it might actually make me a better businessman. Honest money grows differently than dirty money. It might grow slower, but you can sleep at night. The day Mr. Camden was released from the hospital, Tommy and I met his taxi at the penthouse entrance. He moved slowly, still weak from the surgery, but there was something different about his bearing that had nothing to do with physical recovery. The constant tension that had defined his presence for years seemed to have lifted, replaced by the calm exhaustion of a man who had decided to stop running from himself. It looks different, he said, as we rode the elevator up to the 62nd floor, studying the mirrored walls that had once reflected his image as a master of the financial universe. What looks different? Tommy asked. Everything. All of it. He was quiet until the elevator opened into the marble foyer, then paused before stepping out. I want to show you both something. We followed him to his study, where he opened the safe that had once held the most sensitive documents related to his hidden financial empire. Instead of the usual stacks of papers and encrypted drives, it now contained a single manila folder. Full disclosure, he said, handing the folder to Tommy. Every account, every asset, every investment, legal and illegal. The attorney has copies, the government will have copies, and now you have copies. No more secrets in this family. Tommy opened the folder with trembling hands. scanning documents that represented wealth beyond most people's imagination, but also detailed the criminal activities that had jeopardized everything. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a mixture of disappointment and relief. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Camden sank into his leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 57 years. "Because I was terrified of losing what I had. Because I thought more money would make me feel safer, more secure. Because I convinced myself that rules were for other people, and that being clever was the same as being right. And now? Now I know that the only security worth having is knowing you can look at yourself in the mirror without shame. And that the only wealth that matters is the kind that doesn't disappear when the government investigates your bank accounts." That evening, I prepared what would be our last dinner in the penthouse. A simple meal of roast chicken and vegetables, the kind of comfort food that had sustained this family through countless ordinary evenings before wealth and deception had complicated everything. We ate in the kitchen. Instead of the formal dining room, the three of us crowded around the small table where I usually ate my solitary meals. "Margaret," Mr. Camden said as I served dessert, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you decide is perfectly acceptable." My hands stilled over the plates. "What is it?" "The house in Westchester needs a lot of work to be livable again. The garden is overgrown. The kitchen needs updating, and frankly, I'm going to need help learning how to live as a normal person instead of a millionaire who always had staff to handle every detail of daily life." He paused, meeting my eyes with an expression I had rarely seen in 28 years of employment. Genuine vulnerability. "Would you consider coming with us? Not as an employee, but as family?" The words hung in the air like the aroma of a favorite meal, filling spaces I hadn't realized were empty. "What about your legal troubles? The investigation?" "They'll follow me to Westchester, of course. There will be interviews, hearings, probably months of uncertainty before everything is resolved. It won't be an easy time." Tommy looked between us, hope and anxiety warring in his expression. "Say yes, Margaret, please. We need you." I thought about the tiny apartment in Queens where I had lived alone for nearly 3 decades, returning each night to empty rooms and silence. I thought about the routines that had defined my life: cooking for others, cleaning up after others, caring for others while remaining invisible in my own existence. Then I looked at these two faces, one lined with premature aging from stress and poor choices, the other young and hopeful despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. For the first time in my adult life, I was being asked not to serve but to belong. "Yes," I whispered, and then louder, with more conviction. "Yes, I'll come with you." The next few months passed in a blur of legal meetings, financial disclosures, and the strange process of dismantling a lifestyle built on hidden wealth. The penthouse was sold to pay penalties and legal fees, its marble halls and crystal chandeliers passing to new owners who would never know the secrets those walls had contained. The cars went to auction, along with most of the luxury furnishings that had defined Mr. Camden's public image as a successful businessman. But in the midst of all this loss, something unexpected began to grow. Without the constant pressure of maintaining his financial deceptions, Mr. Camden started to remember who he had been before fear and greed had consumed him. He spent time with Tommy, really spent time, not the distracted moments stolen between conference calls and business meetings, but hours of genuine conversation about plans and dreams and fears. And me? For the first time in decades, I felt truly needed rather than simply useful. As we prepared to move to Westchester, I found myself making decisions about furniture and decorating, about which of my own possessions to bring to our new home. The invisible woman was becoming visible, not through dramatic gestures, but through the quiet accumulation of choices that declared her existence mattered. The house in Westchester was indeed in need of work, but it welcomed us with the warmth that only a real home can provide. Built in the 1920s, it had character that no amount of money could buy. Hardwood floors that creaked with history, windows that framed views of actual trees instead of steel and glass, a kitchen where sunlight streamed through checkered curtains instead of bouncing off marble and chrome. My new room was on the second floor, with a view of the garden that would become my special project. It was larger than my apartment in Queens and filled with more natural light than I had enjoyed in years. But more than the physical space, it represented something I had never dared to hope for, a place where I belonged, not because I was needed to work, but because I was wanted as part of a family. The legal resolution took nearly a year, but Mr. Camden's decision to cooperate fully with the investigation ultimately protected him from criminal prosecution. The financial penalties were severe. More than $70 million in hidden assets were surrendered to the government, along with additional fines and interest that reduced his remaining wealth to approximately $30 million. Still rich by any reasonable standard, but no longer the financial titan he had once been. The business empire that had once seemed so important was restructured, with Mr. Camden taking a less prominent role in day-to-day operations and focusing instead on legitimate investments that could be proudly disclosed on tax returns. "It's funny," he said one evening as we sat on the back porch watching Tommy practice guitar in the garden. "I thought losing all that money would feel like dying. Instead, it feels like waking up." I looked at him. Really looked, and saw a man who had aged in the best possible way. The stress lines around his eyes had faded, replaced by the softer wrinkles that come from laughter. His hair was completely silver now, but it suited him better than the artificial darkness he had maintained during his years of financial deception. Most importantly, his eyes held peace. The kind that comes from knowing you can account for every dollar you own. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "Sometimes, when you're paying bills or thinking about the life you used to have?" He considered the question seriously, watching his son coax melody from 6 strings in the golden light of a Westchester evening. "I regret the choices that made it necessary. I regret the years I spent being afraid and the distance it created between Tommy and me. But losing the hidden money, the secret accounts, the constant fear of discovery. No, I don't regret that for a moment." Tommy struck a particularly beautiful chord, and we both stopped talking to listen. At 17, he had grown into a thoughtful young man with his father's intelligence, but a gentleness that spoke to the healing that had taken place in our small, imperfect family. He'd been accepted to several prestigious universities, and though his father could no longer afford the most expensive options, there was still enough money for an excellent education. More importantly, there was time. Time for father and son to rebuild their relationship. Time to discover who they were when they weren't defined by vast wealth or the pressure to maintain it. Time to become a real family instead of 3 people who happened to live in the same expensive house. As autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, I found myself settling into a life I had never imagined possible. The garden bloomed under my care, producing vegetables and herbs that reminded me why I had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. Not because it was my job, but because creating nourishment for people you love is one of life's purest joys. Tommy graduated from high school that spring, and we celebrated with a party in the backyard rather than the elaborate affair that would have marked the occasion during the penthouse years. Friends came, real friends, not business associates or social climbers, and filled our modest home with genuine warmth and laughter. I made all the food myself, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Each dish represented not just sustenance, but love made visible, care expressed through the ancient ritual of feeding those who matter. And for the first time in my adult life, I sat down to eat with the guests instead of serving silently from the background. "Margaret," one of Tommy's friends said as he reached for a second helping of my famous lasagna, "this is incredible. You should open a restaurant." The suggestion made me laugh. But later that evening, as I cleaned up, with help from Tommy and his father, another change that would have been unthinkable in our previous life, the idea lingered. At 74, was I too old to start over? Too set in my ways to imagine a future that looked nothing like my past? "What are you thinking about?" Mr. Camden asked, finding me still in the kitchen long after the last guest had gone home. "That boy's suggestion about opening a restaurant. It's ridiculous, of course." "Why is it ridiculous?" I gestured to myself, gray hair, weathered hands, a woman who had spent her entire adult life as someone else's employee. "Look at me. I'm nearly 75. I have no business experience, no capital to invest, no idea how to run my own company." He dried a wine glass carefully, something he was still learning to do after years of having others handle such mundane tasks. "You know what I learned from this whole experience, Margaret? Age is just a number if you still have passion, and you clearly have capital if you know how to create something people want. As for business experience, well, I know a little about that, and I'd be honored to help if you're serious." The conversation stayed with me through the summer, growing stronger like vegetables in my garden. I began to pay attention to the way people reacted to my cooking, the requests for recipes, the way conversation stopped when I brought out a new dish. Maybe there was something to the idea after all. That fall, as Tommy left for college, Mr. Camden and I found ourselves alone in the house for the first time. It could have been awkward. Two people who had spent decades in carefully defined roles suddenly navigating a relationship without clear boundaries. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We settled into new routines. I cooked not large meals for a family, but smaller, more intimate dinners for two. We talked in the evenings, really talked, about books and politics and memories, about his business experiences and my years of observation from the sidelines of wealth. He helped with dishes and gradually took over some of the household tasks that I had always handled alone. One evening, in October, as we cleaned up after a particularly successful experiment with coco vin, he brought up the restaurant idea again. "I've been thinking about what you said last spring, about being too old to start over." I looked up from the pot I was scrubbing, surprised. "That was months ago." "Good ideas don't disappear just because time passes. They get stronger if they're really meant to be." He hung up the dish towel and turned to face me. "I've been doing some research. There's a small building for lease in the village, right on Main Street. It used to be a bakery, so it already has some of the necessary equipment. The rent is reasonable and the location gets good foot traffic." My hands stilled in the soapy water. "You've been researching restaurant locations?" "I've been researching a dream, Margaret. Your dream if you want it to be." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. After nearly 8 decades of life, was I brave enough to bet on myself? To step out of the shadows where I had spent my entire career and claim my own place in the light? The answer came not in words, but in the sudden certainty that flooded through me like warm sunshine. Yes, at 74, with silver hair and arthritis in my hands, I was finally ready to stop being invisible. The restaurant opened the following spring, just as the daffodils in my garden pushed through the last patches of snow. We called it Margaret's Table, simple, honest, unpretentious. The menu featured the kind of food I had been cooking for 50 years, comfort dishes made with fresh ingredients and genuine care, each recipe passed down through generations or perfected through decades of practice. Mr. Camden, who had insisted I call him Jonathan now that our relationship had evolved beyond employer and employee, helped with the business side of things. His experience with financial planning and management proved invaluable in setting up our operations, and his connections in the community brought in customers who might not have otherwise discovered a small restaurant run by a woman no one had ever heard of. But it was Tommy who provided the most important support of all. Home from college for the opening, he worked as a server that first week, charming customers with the same genuine warmth that had made our kitchen conversations so precious during his childhood. More importantly, his presence reminded me that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to stand with you when you're brave enough to risk everything for a dream. The first review appeared in the local newspaper 3 weeks after we opened. "Margaret's Table," wrote the food critic, "serves the kind of food that makes you remember why eating is about more than just nutrition. Chef Margaret Santos doesn't just cook, she nurtures, creating dishes that feel like receiving a hug from someone who genuinely cares about your well-being." In a world of flashy restaurants focused on Instagram-worthy presentation, Margaret's Table offers something more valuable, a meal that feeds your soul. Reading those words, I cried for the first time in months, not tears of sadness or frustration, but tears of recognition. Finally, someone had seen what I had been trying to give for my entire career: love made visible through food, care expressed through the ancient ritual of nourishment. 2 years have passed since that opening day, and Margaret's Table has become an unexpected success. Not the kind of success measured in millions of dollars or media attention, but the quieter, more sustaining success that comes from knowing you're doing exactly what you were meant to do. Our regular customers have become like extended family. Mrs. Patterson comes in every Tuesday for lunch, always ordering the chicken pot pie and always leaving with a story about her grandchildren. The Henderson family celebrates every birthday and anniversary at Table 6, which they've informally claimed as their own. College students from the nearby university gather here during exam periods, knowing that my homemade soup and fresh bread will provide the comfort they need to face their stress. But perhaps the most meaningful success is the transformation I see in Jonathan and Tommy when they visit. The distance that once separated father and son has been replaced by genuine affection and mutual respect. Tommy calls home regularly, sharing his experiences and asking for advice. Jonathan listens, really listens, instead of simply waiting for his turn to speak. And me? At 76, I have finally learned what it means to be truly visible. Not because I'm serving others, though I still love to cook, but because I have claimed my own space in the world and filled it with authenticity and purpose. The legal troubles that once seemed so overwhelming are now just an unpleasant chapter in Jonathan's past. The government investigation concluded, the penalties were paid, and the legitimate businesses continued to prosper under his more careful management. The fear that had driven him to hide assets and deceive authorities has been replaced by the confidence that comes from knowing every dollar in his accounts can be accounted for. Sometimes, late at night when the restaurant is closed and I'm doing the final cleaning before heading home, I think about that afternoon when Jonathan collapsed in the penthouse kitchen. If I had been a different person, someone who saw only her job responsibilities rather than human need, someone who chose to remain invisible even in a moment of crisis, his story might have ended very differently. But I didn't choose invisibility that day. I chose to act, to care, to step forward when someone needed help. And in saving his life, I discovered my own. Last month, Tommy graduated from college with a degree in music composition. Jonathan and I attended the ceremony together, cheering from the audience as he walked across the stage to receive his diploma. That evening, we celebrated at Margaret's Table with a special dinner I had prepared just for our family. "I have something to tell you both," Tommy said as we finished dessert, his expression serious but his eyes bright with excitement. "I've been offered a position with a recording studio in Nashville. It's entry-level, mostly administrative work, but they're also interested in some of my compositions." I felt my heart swell with pride and break with impending separation at the same time. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. When do you start?" "Next month." But here's the thing. I don't want to just take this job and disappear into my own life. I want to stay connected to both of you, to what we've built together. So I was thinking, what if Margaret's Table opened a location in Nashville? Nothing huge, just a small place where I could help manage the business side while you focus on the cooking. I looked at Jonathan, whose expression mirrored my own mixture of surprise and possibility. "That's a big step," I said carefully. "Are you sure you want to tie yourself to an old woman's restaurant instead of focusing completely on your music career?" Tommy reached across the table to take my hand, his grip firm and warm. "Margaret, you're not just an old woman with a restaurant. You're family. You've been more of a mother to me than my biological mother ever was. And this place, what we've created together, it's part of who I am now. I can't imagine my future without it being connected to yours." The tears came then, not the frustrated tears of my invisible years or even the joyful tears of recognition when the first review was published, but the deep, satisfied tears of a woman who has lived long enough to see love multiply instead of diminish when it's shared. 6 months later, we opened Margaret's Table Nashville in a converted house near Music Row. Tommy manages the daily operations while pursuing his music career, and I split my time between the two locations, creating menus that honor both the comfort food traditions of our New York restaurant and the southern influences of our new city. Jonathan visits regularly, often staying for weeks at a time. He has become our unofficial business advisor and official taste tester, offering suggestions based on his years of business experience while never trying to take over or diminish the vision that Tommy and I have created together. But more than that, he has become something I never expected to have at this stage of my life, a true partner. Not the employer-employee relationship that defined our first 28 years together. Not even the grateful patient-caregiver dynamic that emerged after his heart attack, but a genuine partnership between equals who have chosen to build something meaningful together. We don't live together. I maintain my own apartment above the Nashville restaurant while he keeps his house in Westchester, but we share decisions, dreams, and the comfortable intimacy that comes from having survived crisis together and emerged stronger on the other side. Sometimes I catch myself marveling at the strange turns life can take. 20 years ago, if someone had told me that I would own 2 successful restaurants, that the cold millionaire I cooked for would become one of my dearest friends, that his son would choose to build his own life around businesses we created together, I would have thought they were describing someone else's life entirely. But as I've learned, invisibility is often a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. For decades, I chose to remain in the background, to serve others, while never claiming my own place at the table. I told myself it was humility, or dedication, or simply the way things were supposed to be. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of being seen and found wanting, afraid of taking up space that might belong to someone else, afraid of discovering that my contributions weren't as valuable as I hoped they were. It took a medical emergency and a millionaire's moment of vulnerability to show me that my contributions mattered enough to save a life. It took a legal crisis and the threat of losing everything to teach me that honesty and authenticity are worth more than any amount of hidden wealth. It took reaching my 70s to learn that it's never too late to step out of the shadows and claim your own place in the light. The restaurant business isn't easy. There are long hours, difficult customers, equipment breakdowns, and the constant pressure of managing expenses while maintaining quality. Some days I'm so tired that my arthritis makes every movement painful, and I wonder if I was crazy to start this adventure at an age when most people are settling into quiet retirement. But then a customer tells me that my beef stew reminds them of their grandmother's cooking. Or I see Tommy's face light up when he successfully negotiates a better price with a supplier. Or Jonathan proudly shows me the latest financial reports that prove our little restaurants are not just surviving, but thriving. And I remember why this journey has been worth every challenge. I'm no longer the invisible woman who cooked for others while remaining unseen herself. I'm Margaret Santos, chef and owner of 2 restaurants that bear my name, a woman who learned that true wealth isn't measured in hidden bank accounts, but in the relationships that sustain us through both crisis and celebration. My hands are still stained with turmeric and olive oil. My back still aches from years of bending over stoves and sinks. But now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone who matters, someone whose contributions are recognized and valued, someone who chose to save a life and in doing so saved her own. The path from invisible cook in a Manhattan penthouse to restaurant owner in 2 cities hasn't been straight or smooth. It's been marked by heartbreak and healing, by secrets revealed and trust rebuilt, by the slow transformation of 3 people who learn to see each other clearly instead of through the distorting lens of wealth and power and fear. But every mile of that winding path has led to this moment, standing in my own kitchen, preparing food that will nourish people who know my name and value my presence, surrounded by the warmth of family that was chosen rather than inherited, confident in my own worth after decades of invisibility. And if you're listening to this story while you cook for someone who never says thank you, while you clean up messes that others made, while you wonder if your contributions matter in a world that seems to value everything except the quiet, essential work of caring for others, I want you to know something. You are not invisible unless you choose to be. Your work matters. Your presence matters. You matter. Not because of what you can do for others, but because of who you are when you finally step into the light and let yourself be seen. It's never too late to save a life. Sometimes the life you save is your own. The Nashville location has been open for 3 years now, and watching Tommy balance his music career with restaurant management has taught me something new about the nature of dreams. He records sessions during the day, writes songs in the quiet hours before the restaurant opens, and serves customers who have become regulars as devoted as those we left behind in Westchester. His compositions have begun to attract attention from recording artists, and last month, one of his songs was recorded by a country singer whose album debuted in the top 10. I couldn't have done this without having Margaret's Table as my foundation, he told a local newspaper reporter who interviewed him about his success. When you know you have a home base, when you know there are people who believe in you and a business that provides stability, you can take creative risks that would be impossible otherwise. Reading that interview, I realized that our restaurant hadn't held him back from his musical dreams. It had made them possible. The security of knowing he could always earn a living, doing work he found meaningful, surrounded by people who loved him, gave him the courage to pursue the uncertain path of artistic success. Jonathan's transformation has been equally remarkable, though perhaps less visible to the outside world. The man who once measured his worth in stock portfolios and hidden assets now finds satisfaction in the simpler metrics of honest business. His remaining investments are managed conservatively but transparently, his tax returns filed without fear of government scrutiny, his sleep untroubled by the anxiety that once consumed him. He has started teaching a business ethics course at the local community college, something that would have been unthinkable during his years of financial deception, but now seems like a natural extension of hard-won wisdom. His students are mostly working adults, people trying to improve their circumstances through education, and he approaches their dreams with the same seriousness he once reserved for million-dollar deals. Professor Camden really understands what it's like to face difficult choices, one of his students told me when she came to the restaurant for dinner. He doesn't preach about right and wrong. He talks about consequences, about the weight of carrying secrets, about how much easier it is to build something when you don't have to hide what you're doing. The woman dining with her nodded. He made us calculate the real cost of dishonesty, not just the financial penalties if you're caught, but the emotional toll, the impact on relationships, the way fear changes everything you touch. It was the most powerful business lesson I've ever learned. These conversations remind me that our story, the heart attack that stopped time, the secrets that nearly destroyed everything, the slow rebuilding that followed, isn't just our own. It's a story about the choices available to all of us, about the possibility of redemption even when we think we've gone too far, about the courage required to step into the light after years of living in shadows. Last year, I was invited to speak at a conference for women entrepreneurs. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of women who had dared to start their own businesses, I felt the familiar flutter of fear that had once kept me invisible. But alongside the fear was something new, the unshakable knowledge that my story mattered, that my experience could light the way for someone else who needed to believe in her own worth. I started Margaret's Table when I was 74 years old, I began, and watched surprise ripple through the audience. I spent most of my adult life cooking for other people, serving their dreams while never claiming my own. I thought it was too late to start over, too late to matter, too late to step out of the background and into my own life. I told them about the years of invisibility, about the moment Jonathan collapsed and I chose to act instead of simply serve, about the legal troubles that forced all of us to reconsider what we thought we knew about success and security. I spoke about fear, the fear of being seen, the fear of failure, the fear of discovering that our contributions don't matter as much as we hope they do. The truth is, I concluded, we make ourselves invisible because it feels safer than risking visibility and being found wanting. But invisible people can't save lives, can't build dreams, can't change the world in the small, essential ways that matter most. The greatest risk isn't being seen and judged. It's never being seen at all. The standing ovation that followed wasn't for me specifically, I realized, but for every woman who has ever cooked unnoticed meals, cleaned unacknowledged messes, cared for others while never claiming care for herself. It was for the universal experience of feeling invisible in your own life and the possibility, always available, never too late, of stepping into the light. Now, at 79, I find myself in the unlikely position of being something I never expected. A mentor, young women starting their own food businesses seek me out for advice. Older women contemplating dramatic life changes ask how I found the courage to bet on myself so late in life. Even men sometimes come to the restaurant not just for the food, but for the story, for evidence that it's possible to rebuild after spectacular failure. Just last week, a woman my age sat at table 6, Tommy's old family table, and ordered the chicken pot pie with hands that shook slightly as she lifted her fork. After the meal, she approached me in the kitchen. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For 43 years, I cooked for him, cleaned for him, organized his life. Now I don't know who I am without someone to take care of. People keep telling me to find hobbies, but I don't want hobbies. I want to matter again." I set down the dish I was washing and really looked at her. This woman who had spent her life in service to others and now faced the terrifying freedom of choice. "What did you love about taking care of your husband?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Making him happy, seeing his face light up when I cooked his favorite meal or when I surprised him with something special. I loved knowing that I made his life better, more comfortable, more joyful." Those feelings, that desire to bring comfort and joy through food, they don't have to die with your husband. They can grow into something new, something that's entirely your own. We talked for an hour about possibilities, about the difference between serving others and serving yourself, about the way love can expand rather than diminish when it's shared with a wider circle. When she left, she took with her not just a full stomach, but a spark of possibility that I recognized from my own journey. 3 months later, she returned with news. She had started a small catering business specializing in comfort food for people dealing with loss. Meals for families after funerals, food for support groups, simple, nourishing dishes for people who need to be cared for when they're too grief-stricken to care for themselves. "I'm still taking care of people," she told me, her eyes bright with purpose. "But now I'm also taking care of myself. I matter again, not just because I can serve others, but because I chose to build something meaningful with my own hands." These encounters have taught me that our story, mine, Jonathan's, Tommy's, is really about the universal human need to matter, to be seen, to know that our presence in the world makes a difference. The specifics of wealth and poverty, legal troubles and heart attacks might be unique to us, but the deeper themes resonate with anyone who has ever felt invisible in their own life. The restaurants continue to thrive, but I've begun to think about what comes next. Not retirement in the traditional sense. I can't imagine a life without cooking, without the satisfaction of creating nourishment for others, but perhaps a different kind of contribution. Tommy has suggested we write a cookbook together, not just a collection of recipes, but a memoir of redemption told through the meals that sustained us through our darkest and brightest moments. People don't just want to know how to make your pot roast, he explained during one of our planning conversations. They want to know how food became the bridge between who we were and who we became. They want to understand how sitting down together at your table taught us to see each other as family instead of strangers who happen to share a house. Jonathan has supported the idea enthusiastically, offering to share his perspective on how his relationship with food changed as he moved from the sterile luxury of catered dinners to the warm intimacy of home-cooked meals made with love. "I never actually tasted my food," he admitted, "until I started eating at Margaret's table. I consumed calories for fuel, but I never understood that a meal could be an expression of care, a form of communication, a way of saying, 'You matter to me,' without using words." The cookbook project has become our new shared dream, a way to capture not just recipes, but the transformation that happens when invisible people finally step into the light. We've been working with a wonderful editor who understands that our story is really about the countless unsung heroes, the cooks, cleaners, caregivers, and support staff who make other people's lives possible while remaining unseen themselves. "Food is love made visible," I said during our first meeting with the publisher, "but so many of us who do the cooking remain invisible." This book is for everyone who has ever wondered if their contributions matter, everyone who has ever felt taken for granted, everyone who needs to know that it's never too late to step out of the shadows and claim their own place at the table. The advance reviews have been encouraging, but more meaningful to me are the early readers who tell us they see themselves in our story. A woman from Texas wrote to say that reading our manuscript gave her the courage to start the bakery she had dreamed about for 20 years. A man from Ohio shared that our story helped him recognize and appreciate the woman who had cooked for his family for 15 years and inspired him to give her a raise and profit sharing in his business. Most touching of all was the letter from a young woman in California. "My grandmother spent her whole life cooking for our family, always in the background, never sitting down to eat with us until everyone else was served. I thought that was just how grandmothers were supposed to be." Your book made me realize that she wasn't naturally selfless. She was invisible by choice, maybe by habit. I called her after I finished reading, and for the first time I asked her to teach me to cook. Not so I could serve others, but so I could carry on the tradition of love she's been expressing through food my whole life. We're planning to open a small restaurant together. At 92, she's going to be my business partner, not just my grandmother. These responses remind me why our story needed to be told, why stepping out of invisibility matters not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. When one invisible person finally claims their place in the light, it makes it easier for others to do the same. The book is scheduled to be published next spring, around the 5th anniversary of Margaret's Table's opening. We're planning a celebration that brings together all the people who have been part of our journey. Customers who became friends, employees who became family, community members who supported a crazy old woman's dream of starting over at an age when most people are winding down. Jonathan jokes that it will be the most honest celebration he's ever hosted. Every dollar spent will be legally documented. Every guest invited for genuine affection rather than business advantage. Every moment savored without the underlying anxiety that once poisoned even his happiest occasions. Tommy is composing a piece of music specifically for the event, a song he calls "Coming Home" that captures the feeling of finding your place in the world after years of searching. He's arranged for some of the recording artists who have performed his songs to join him for the premiere, turning our restaurant celebration into something approaching a concert. But the real music, I think, will be the sound of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses raised by people who have learned to see each other clearly, who have discovered that true wealth lies not in what we can hide, but in what we're brave enough to share. As I write this, sitting in the quiet kitchen of our Nashville location in the early morning hours before we open, I'm struck by how different this solitude feels from the loneliness I once knew. Then I was alone, because I was invisible, overlooked, forgotten even by those who depended on my work. Now I'm alone by choice, taking time to reflect on a life that has expanded beyond anything I could have imagined when I was just the cook in someone else's kitchen. The sun is beginning to rise over Music Row, and soon Tommy will arrive to start prep work for the lunch service. Jonathan is flying in this afternoon for another of his extended visits, and together we'll spend the evening planning the next chapter of whatever this adventure has become. We'll taste new recipes, review financial reports, discuss the cookbook marketing strategy, and probably end up talking late into the night about the small miracles that brought us together. But first, I have a few more hours of this precious solitude, this time to savor the knowledge that I am no longer cooking for people who never see me. I am preparing food for a community that knows my name, values my presence, and understands that every meal I create carries with it the accumulated wisdom of decades spent learning to transform invisible love into visible nourishment. My hands are steady as I begin the familiar ritual of starting another day, checking the walk-in cooler, reviewing the prep list, tasting the soup stock that has been simmering overnight. These are the same movements I've made thousands of times before, but now they carry different weight, different meaning. I am not just doing my job, I am practicing my craft, expressing my art, living my purpose. And in a few hours, when the first customers arrive and the kitchen fills with the controlled chaos of service, I will emerge from behind my stove, not as a shadow, but as the author of every dish that leaves my hands, the creator of an experience that feeds both body and soul, a woman whose life finally matches the full scope of her contributions. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I promise your story matters too. If this touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message can reach another woman who cooks with her soul. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining us on this journey of the heart. We'll be waiting for you in our next story.